January 1940. The world stands frozen literally and figuratively. Across continents. Soldiers fight. Leaders gamble. And ordinary people pray for warmth, food, or simply one more sunrise. It is a time when the earth itself seems to have turned against humanity. From the icy forests of Finland to the war-scorched plains of China, two brutal offensives unfold, reshaping the course of a world already on fire. In the north, the Red Army, confident and colossal, marches into Finland. They believe sheer numbers will guarantee victory. But the Finns, small, determined, and fiercely familiar with their own frozen land, have other plans. Armed with courage, skis, and silence, they strike like ghosts in the snow. What happens next will shock the world and rewrite the rules of warfare. Meanwhile, half a world away, Japan's empire tightens its grip on China. In Shaanxi province, Japanese troops launch a desperate counterattack to rescue a trapped division. Yet the Chinese, scared but unbroken, push back harder than ever. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the haze of gunfire, another battle rages, not just for territory, but for loyalty, honor, and the soul of a divided nation. And behind the scenes, politics twist deeper than the trenches. Former Chinese Prime Minister Wang Jingwei makes a decision that will brand him a traitor in the eyes of history. While soldiers die in the mud, he negotiates peace in secret, believing submission might save his country. But what if that peace is only a mask for conquest? As these events unfold, Europe trembles on the edge. Hitler's ambitions are growing, Stalin's patience is thinning, and millions of innocents are caught in between. The first week of 1940 is not just the beginning of a new year, it is a preview of humanity's darkest hour. This is the story of courage and betrayal, of cold steel and colder choices. It is about how small nations stood against giants, and how power can corrupt even those who dream of peace. Before we dive into these dramatic turning points where heroes rise and empires stumble, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any future episodes. Every week, we uncover the hidden stories behind history's most decisive moments. Now, let us step back in time to a world gripped by snow, fear, and fire, and witness how Finland struck back, and how Japan's counterattack changed everything. While Finland fought to survive in the frozen north, far to the east, China was trapped in a different kind of winter, one made of exhaustion, disillusionment, and betrayal. Years of brutal war had worn down the nation's strength. Entire cities lay in ruins, and the cries of the displaced echoed through shattered streets. The people still fought with remarkable endurance, but beneath the surface, the unity that once fueled resistance was beginning to crack. Since 1937, the conflict with Japan had drained China of nearly everything: its wealth, its manpower, and, for some, its hope. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government had struggled to maintain morale as Japanese forces swept through coastal regions and captured major cities. The capital had already moved more than once, fleeing the relentless advance of the empire. Yet even in retreat, Chiang refused to surrender. He believed that China's sheer size, resilience, and the spirit of its people could eventually wear Japan down. It was a slow, painful resistance built on the promise of eventual justice. But not all shared his conviction. Among those who had once stood beside him was Wang Jingwei, a man whose idealism once matched Chiang's determination. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Wang had been one of the most respected figures in the nationalist movement, a poet-politician who spoke of peace, modernity, and unity. Yet as the war dragged on and Japan's might seemed impossible to overcome, his vision began to change. What began as doubt slowly turned into despair. Wang saw the suffering of the people and concluded that continued resistance would destroy China completely. He began to believe that fighting Japan was futile, that the real danger came not from the invaders' guns, but from the potential collapse of the Chinese nation itself. He saw two specters haunting his homeland: Japanese occupation on one side and communist revolution on the other. The only way to preserve China's essence was to accept a form of peace with Japan, to negotiate terms that might at least protect the nation's core from total ruin. It was a dangerous thought, one that many would later call treason. But Wang convinced himself that he was saving his country, not betraying it. In his view, the West had long exploited Asia, and Japan's rise could be an opportunity for Asian unity against colonial powers. If China and Japan could somehow coexist, perhaps Asia could finally stand on its own. This idea, desperate and fatally misjudged, would lead him down a path from which there was no return. By late 1939, Japan had begun to realize that victory in China would not come easily. Despite occupying vast territories, the Japanese army faced constant resistance, sabotage, and uprisings. The Chinese countryside was filled with guerrilla fighters, both communist and nationalist, and the Japanese command grew wary of a war that refused to end. In Tokyo, some officials began to see Wang Jingwei as a potential instrument of control, a respected Chinese face for their plans of domination. Through secret channels, negotiations began. Wang's envoys met Japanese diplomats in guarded rooms filled with smoke and whispered promises. The Japanese spoke of peace, reconstruction, and partnership, but the truth behind their words was clear. They wanted a compliant government that would give them access to China's resources, labor, and markets. Still, Wang believed that he could bargain, that he could protect something of China's sovereignty in the process. It was a tragic miscalculation. In December 1939, as the world celebrated another new year in the shadow of war, Wang signed a secret agreement with Japan to establish a reorganized national government in Nanjing. It would be presented as a rebirth of Chinese leadership, but in reality, it was a puppet regime controlled by the occupiers. The treaty's terms were harsh. Japan would retain military presence across China, control economic production, and dictate foreign policy. Northern regions would remain under separate Japanese administration, ensuring that even this illusion of unity was fractured from the start. But not everyone involved was blind to the deception. Gao Zhongwu, a diplomat who had helped draft the agreement, was horrified by how thoroughly Japan had manipulated the talks. Fearing for his country's honor, he secretly photographed the treaty and leaked it to Chiang Kai-shek's government. When the details became public, outrage swept through China. The truth was undeniable. Japan had no intention of peace, only submission. Chiang seized the opportunity. Propaganda spread across the nation, exposing the so-called peace treaty for what it was: a trap disguised as diplomacy. Newspapers carried headlines denouncing collaboration, while pamphlets described Wang Jingwei as the man who sold his country's soul for an empty promise. For many Chinese citizens who had lost everything to war, this revelation hardened their resolve. They would rather die fighting than live under false peace. As Wang fled to Nanjing to begin building his new regime, his name became a symbol of betrayal. Yet in private, he reportedly spoke of his actions with sorrow, insisting that history would one day understand him. He believed he was saving China from extinction, even as he delivered it into the hands of its conquerors. History, however, is rarely kind to those who serve both sides. By early 1940, China was a nation divided not just by war, but by ideology and trust. On the battlefields, soldiers fought for every village, every river crossing, while in smoky rooms politicians gambled with the country's future. The dream of unity that had once inspired a generation had become a battlefield of its own, one where honor, fear, and ambition collided in silence. In the chaos of that winter, the struggle for China's survival was no longer fought solely with bullets or bombs. It was fought in the minds of its leaders, in the choices they made under impossible pressure, and in the quiet resilience of millions who simply refused to give up. Wang Jingwei sat in silence as the city outside his window trembled under distant echoes of war. The lights flickered, the air smelled faintly of smoke, and every newspaper headline reminded him of the same painful truth: China was bleeding, and no one seemed able to stop it. Once hailed as a hero of the revolution, a voice for national unity and progress, Wang now found himself consumed by doubt. He had seen too many promises broken, too many young men buried beneath flags that no longer inspired hope. In his heart, he believed that the path Chiang Kai-shek followed, endless resistance against an unstoppable enemy, would only lead to ruin. For years, the war with Japan had turned into a grinding nightmare. Cities were captured and recaptured, villages burned, and families scattered like ash in the wind. Wang had watched his country's spirit erode under the weight of unending conflict. He saw the nationalist government move from one temporary capital to another, chased by the relentless advance of Japanese troops. Each speech of defiance, each call to stand firm, sounded more hollow to him than the last. Somewhere along the way, he began to believe that the only salvation left for China was to surrender part of its pride in exchange for peace. It was a belief born not of cowardice but of despair. Wang convinced himself that Japan's domination was inevitable, and that resistance would destroy the very thing they were trying to protect: the essence of the Chinese nation. In his China's survival required commerce. The West, he argued privately, had long exploited Asia. Now Japan sought to build a new order where Asian nations could rise together. To him, cooperation with Japan was not betrayal but strategy, a way to preserve the country's soul under unbearable pressure. It was a vision as seductive as it was dangerous, and it drew him deeper into the shadows of diplomacy. Through a web of secret envoys and coded messages, Wang opened quiet channels of communication with Japanese officials. The first meetings were cautious, each side testing the other's intent. Japan saw an opportunity: a Chinese leader with prestige and influence who could give their occupation the appearance of legitimacy. Wang saw something different, a narrow bridge between war and survival, one that he hoped he could cross before China collapsed entirely. Yet, from the beginning, the balance of power was unmistakable. The Japanese delegates smiled politely as they dictated terms, and Wang listened, telling himself that he could still steer the conversation toward fairness. As months passed, those secret negotiations deepened. In Tokyo, he was received with calculated respect, entertained by generals and bureaucrats who spoke of friendship and rebuilding. They painted a future where China would flourish again, rebuilt under the guidance of a benevolent Japan. Wang, wary and increasingly isolated from his former comrades, wanted to believe them. He imagined himself not as a puppet but as a savior, the man who would end a war no one else could. To him, peace was worth the price of pride. By late 1939, the plan was set in motion. The Japanese proposed the creation of a new Chinese government based in Nanjing, the same city that had witnessed one of the darkest massacres in modern history. It was a grim irony, one Wang either ignored or rationalized as symbolic redemption. The agreement, drafted behind closed doors, promised cooperation between the two nations, but its true nature was clear: Japan would control the military, the economy, and even internal policy. China's supposed independence would exist only on paper. Wang signed the document with trembling hands, aware of what it meant but too entangled in his own justification to turn back. When the ink dried, the reorganized national government of China was born, a government in name but one bound by invisible chains. Wang took his place as its leader, a man celebrated by his new patrons as a statesman of peace, yet despised by his own people as the embodiment of betrayal. Japanese newspapers praised him as a visionary, while Chinese whispers called him the man who sold his soul for comfort. Even those who once admired him could not understand how a patriot had become a collaborator. But fate has a way of exposing illusions. Gao Zhongwu, one of Wang's trusted diplomats, had seen the full extent of the treaty's terms. He realized that the so-called partnership was nothing more than subjugation disguised in polite language. Unable to stomach the deceit, he made a bold decision. He secretly photographed the agreement and smuggled the images out. Within weeks, Chiang Kai-shek's government released them to the public. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Across China, anger erupted. The secret treaty confirmed what many had feared, that Japan sought not peace, but control, and that Wang's government was a mere instrument of empire. In cities still under Chinese control, posters appeared denouncing him. Pamphlets compared him to ancient traitors who had sold out dynasties for gold. His name became a curse whispered by soldiers in the trenches and mothers in mourning, for a population already enduring unimaginable suffering. This revelation turned their exhaustion into fury. Chiang's propaganda machine seized upon the betrayal. He positioned himself as the true defender of China's sovereignty, contrasting his defiance with Wang's submission. The story of the leaked treaty rallied the people, uniting them briefly against both the invader and those who collaborated with him. Ironically, Wang's attempt at peace gave new strength to the very resistance he had abandoned. Inside his headquarters in Nanjing, Wang was said to have grown increasingly withdrawn. He spoke to visitors about history's judgment, insisting that one day people would see his decision differently. Perhaps, he said, future generations would understand that he had sacrificed his reputation to save what remained of the nation. But history rarely rewards those who yield to occupation, no matter how noble their intentions. The tragedy of Wang Jingwei lies not only in his actions, but in his belief that moral compromise could secure survival. He failed to see that peace built on domination is no peace at all. His government survived only under Japanese guns, its ministers taking orders from foreign advisors, its symbols of authority hollow. In the eyes of the world, it was not the rebirth of China, but the shadow of one. And so, as the snows fell over Nanjing and distant battlefields still echoed with gunfire, Wang's dream of salvation became another wound in China's long struggle. His signature on that secret treaty marked not the end of war, but the beginning of a deeper betrayal, one written not in blood, but in ink, and remembered long after the guns had gone silent. In the dimly lit study of Nanjing's government building, Gozongwu sat alone, the treaty laid open before him like a confession carved into paper. Each line shimmered under the lamplight, carefully worded promises of cooperation, peace, and reconstruction. Yet beneath the elegant phrasing, Gao saw the truth that others refused to admit. It was not a partnership, it was surrender. Japan's clauses reached into every vein of China's sovereignty. Its economy, its army, even its right to speak freely. To Gao, the signatures on that document were not marks of diplomacy but of submission. His superior, Wang Jingwei, had convinced himself that this treaty would save China, that peace with Japan was the only way to end the nation's suffering. But as Go read, all he could see was a slow and silent death of independence. He remembered the days before the war, before cities fell, before rivers ran red. He had believed, like many others, that unity would save them. But the endless conflict had fractured the country, leaving men like Wang desperate for an escape. Now, sitting in that silent room, Gao felt an unbearable weight pressing down on him. He thought of the families forced from their homes, the children growing up amid ruins, the soldiers dying in the mud for a dream that seemed to fade with every passing year. How? He wondered. Could this document be the answer? How could China be reborn under the shadow of occupation? The decision came to him slowly. Then all at once, Go realized that silence was complicity. If he allowed this secret to remain hidden, then history would remember him as another man who looked away while his nation was stripped of dignity. So he decided to act not for recognition, not even for revenge, but for truth. Somewhere within him, the flame of loyalty to his country still burned, dim but steady. He would expose the lie that had been sold as peace. Go began to move carefully. The Japanese presence in Nanjing was suffocating. Spies and informants lingered everywhere. One careless word could mean disappearance. Using his diplomatic credentials, he gained temporary access to the treaty, claiming he needed to review its details for translation. Every motion had to be precise, every glance measured. When the guards turned their eyes away, he unfolded his small camera, an imported German model he had carried for years. The mechanical click of the shutter sounded like thunder in his ears. Line, page. He captured the secret that would soon ignite an uproar. That night, he sealed the negatives in a hidden compartment within his briefcase. His escape from Nanjing was a blur of fear and calculation. Under the guise of official travel, he boarded a train bound for Shanghai, then made his way through the fragile network of underground sympathizers loyal to the nationalist government. It was a journey through shadows, filled with false papers and silent handshakes. When he finally reached Chongqing, the provisional capital of Chiang Kai-shek's government, he was pale, exhausted, but resolute. He handed the treaty photographs to officials who immediately grasped their value. Within days, Chiang's propaganda department went to work. The photographs were duplicated and distributed across Free China and beyond. The documents, stamped with official seals, bore irrefutable proof that Japan's peace plan was nothing more than a blueprint for domination. The so-called reorganized national government under Wang Jingwei was shown to be a puppet regime, its independence an illusion crafted to pacify the conquered, for many who had clung to the hope that peace might still come honorably. This revelation was shattering. The news spread like wildfire. In every market and village, people gathered to whisper and rage. Posters and leaflets appeared overnight, displaying Wang Jingwei's name beside words of condemnation. Newspapers printed excerpts of the treaty, exposing how Japan intended to control China's military, industry, and even education. It was a betrayal that pierced through exhaustion and despair, reigniting a sense of unity among those who still resisted. In the mountain strongholds where the nationalist army regrouped, soldiers passed around smuggled copies of the treaty, reading aloud the words that confirmed what they had long suspected. Japan sought not peace, but total subjugation. The outrage that followed gave new life to Chiang's cause. Radio broadcasts across China used the leak as a rallying cry. The voice of the announcer trembled with fury as he spoke of Wang's treachery and Gao's courage, declaring that China would never kneel, even in defeat. The Japanese, realizing the damage done, tried to suppress the news, arresting anyone suspected of spreading it. But it was too late. The truth, once released, could not be silenced. Wang Jingwei, who had once hoped to be seen as a peacemaker, now found himself branded as a traitor. In Tokyo and Nanjing, Japanese officials fumed at Ge's betrayal, calling for his capture. But his name had already become a symbol, a quiet reminder that conscience could still cut through fear. For Chiang Kai-shek, the leak was a gift wrapped in scandal. It strengthened his political position and reinvigorated his propaganda campaign. He seized the opportunity to draw a stark contrast between himself and his rival. While Wang bowed to occupation, Chiang stood defiant. In speeches broadcast across the front lines, he invoked the courage of Go Zongwu, praising him as a patriot who risked everything to protect the truth. The story resonated deeply with soldiers and civilians alike, becoming part of the moral fabric that sustained resistance during those bleak years. As the months passed, Gao remained in the shadows. He did not seek recognition, nor did he profit from his revelation. Some said he regretted the pain his actions caused his former mentor. Others claimed he knew it was necessary. What is certain is that his decision changed the course of perception in wartime China. The leak exposed the depth of Japan's ambitions, shattered any illusion of benevolent occupation, and turned public opinion decisively against collaboration. In the quiet moments after the scandal broke, Gao is said to have written in his journal that truth, once freed, carries its own weight, that it cannot be controlled, only endured. His act of defiance became one of the few moments in that grim era when moral clarity pierced through the smoke of war. Wang Jingwei's dream of peace through submission withered under the light of that exposure. The very document meant to secure his legacy had undone it. And in the end, as his government continued to function under Japanese command, he became a prisoner of the illusion he had created. Meanwhile, in the hills and battlefronts across China, soldiers marched with renewed determination. They fought not only for victory, but for dignity, fueled by the knowledge that the truth was finally on their side. Gao Zonggu's silent courage had given them more than information. It had restored belief. In a time when betrayal seemed easier than hope, one man's decision to reveal the truth reminded a wounded nation that honor could still exist. Even amid ruin, the forests of northern Finland lay buried beneath a suffocating weight of snow, their silence broken only by the groan of trees bending under frost. The air was so cold that each breath felt like shards of glass. In that frozen world, where daylight barely brushed the horizon, the Soviet 44th Rifle Division trudged through the endless white along a narrow stretch of road known as Rate. Their columns stretched for miles, trucks, artillery, men hunched against the cold, their breath forming ghosts in the air. They had come expecting a quick victory, believing Finland would collapse under the Red Army smite. Instead, they marched deeper into a trap they could neither see nor understand. The Finnish soldiers were nowhere to be found, or so it seemed. Hidden among the trees, camouflaged perfectly in white, they watched every movement. They knew this land as intimately as a hunter knows the habits of his prey. The forests, the frozen swamps, the bends of the Rate Road, all of it was home. For weeks, they had studied the Soviets, waiting for the moment when exhaustion and arrogance would leave the enemy exposed. When that moment came, they struck with precision and fury. The first attack came at dawn, when the dim light of the northern sky blurred the line between night and day. Soviet troops, cold and hungry, were preparing breakfast fires when the stillness shattered. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, and mortars howled through the air, exploding in the midst of the columns. Panic rippled down the road as soldiers scrambled for cover. But there was none. The Finns vanished between shots, melting into the forest before the Soviets could even aim. When the attackers reappeared, it was from a different direction. The enemy seemed to multiply, surrounding them in an invisible ring. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were ski troops, trained for this brutal landscape. They moved silently over the snow, cutting through the cold with effortless speed, peering and disappearing like phantoms. Their white suits made them nearly invisible against the terrain. Each small group operated independently, guided by maps etched into memory rather than paper. They struck supply lines, destroyed vehicles, and severed communications, isolating pockets of Soviet troops until confusion became chaos. For the Red Army, the situation grew desperate. The narrow road that had carried them forward now became a corridor of death. Trucks and tanks bogged down in snowdrifts or burned where they stood. Wounded men froze where they fell. The Finns did not fight in massive waves. Instead, They fought with patience and precision, cutting the Soviet forces into smaller fragments, surrounding and annihilating each in turn. The tactic became known as moti, a word borrowed from firewood, meaning a bundle of logs cut and isolated before being burned. It was an apt metaphor for what the Finnish army did to the invaders. Colonel Jalmar Selasvuo, commanding the Finnish forces, understood the psychological battle as much as the physical one. His men were outnumbered, but he used the land as his ally. The temperature plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Freezing fuel, weapons, and the will to fight. The Soviets, unprepared for such conditions, suffered horribly. Their uniforms were inadequate, their rations spoiled, their fires drew Finnish snipers like moths to flame. Meanwhile, the Finns, hardened by their environment, thrived. They built shelters of snow, slept in layers of wool, and moved at night guided by the northern stars. The Soviets tried to break through, sending armored columns down the road in desperate attempts to regroup. But the Finns had already mined the path and destroyed bridges behind them. When tanks advanced, Finnish soldiers darted close with Molotov cocktails, simple bottles filled with fuel, and a rag for ignition, turning the steel beasts into roaring pyres against the dark. Each explosion lit the forest with a brief orange glow, a fleeting glimpse of figures gliding past on skis before the night swallowed them again. By early January, the Soviet 44th Division was trapped. Supplies ran out. Morale crumbled, and command dissolved into chaos. Some soldiers tried to surrender, waving makeshift white flags, but communication between units had broken down completely. Others tried to flee into the forest, only to vanish in the snow. The once proud division ceased to exist. Out of more than 17,000 men, only a fraction survived to tell what had happened on that lonely road. When Finnish troops finally swept through the remains, the scene was one of silent devastation. Burned trucks lay twisted in the snow, rifles frozen upright beside fallen men, horses still harnessed to carts that would never move again. It was not triumph that filled the Finns' hearts, but grim understanding. They had defended their homeland, but at a terrible cost. The air was thick with the smell of fuel, smoke, and something far older, the heavy scent of war itself. News of the victory spread quickly across the world. Military observers marveled at how a small, under-equipped army had decimated one of the largest forces on Earth. The Battle of Rate Road became a symbol of courage and ingenuity, proof that determination and terrain could overcome even the greatest odds. In Finland, it inspired a sense of unity that transcended politics and fear. Ordinary citizens saw in their soldiers a reflection of themselves, a people unwilling to be broken. For the Soviet Union, the defeat was a humiliation that could not be ignored. Commanders were executed or demoted. Reports were written to soften the disaster. Yet no amount of revision could hide the truth. In the frozen forests of Finland, the Red Army had met an enemy it could not overpower. The lessons of Rate Road would haunt Soviet strategy for years to come. In the quiet that followed, as the smoke cleared and the snow fell anew, the Finnish soldiers buried their dead and prepared for the next wave. They knew the war was far from over. The Soviet machine would return, stronger and angrier. But so would they, silent hunters in a land that belonged to them. The ghosts of Rate Road would remain, whispering through the pines each winter, a reminder that courage thrives even in the coldest darkness, and that freedom, once fought for, can never truly freeze. The silence that followed the last gunfire on the Rate Road was heavier than any sound of battle. Snow drifted down gently, covering the bodies, the broken wagons, and the frozen remnants of an army that had once believed itself unstoppable. The Soviet 44th Division had ceased to exist, its strength buried beneath layers of frost and defeat. The road that had carried them toward victory now stood as their tomb. For miles, the landscape was littered with the wreckage of ambition, charred trucks still smoldering, rifles frozen into soldiers' hands, and shattered helmets half buried in ice. The forest absorbed it all, indifferent and eternal. Those who survived stumbled through the white wasteland, their uniforms stiff with frost, their faces grey from hunger and exhaustion. Many had eaten nothing for days. Their supplies had been cut off early in the battle when Finnish ski troops severed their columns. And what little food remained had frozen solid in the cold. Some tried to the bread over campfires, only to attract snipers who watched from the shadows. Others boiled leather straps or scraped the frozen flesh of horses to survive a few more hours. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through their coats, through their skin, until even their blood seemed to slow. Fingers blackened and fell away. Breath froze into a white crust on their collars. Men who stopped to rest often never woke again. The Finnish soldiers who later moved through the battlefield found sea scenes too grim for triumph. Hundreds of Soviet soldiers lay huddled in shallow trenches, their arms still locked together as if seeking warmth in death. Frozen in mid-motion, they appeared almost peaceful, but their final moments had been anything but. The cold had claimed them faster than bullets. At -40 degrees, even the act of breathing could kill, and many suffocated as their lungs filled with ice crystals. Others had succumbed to starvation and despair, their bodies collapsing beside useless rifles. The snow muffled everything, creating an eerie calm over the devastation. For the Finns, survival itself was victory. When they began to sift through the aftermath, what they found was staggering. Dozens of tanks stood abandoned, their engines cracked by frost, hundreds of machine guns, thousands of rifles, artillery pieces, ammunition crates, all left behind by an army that had crumbled in confusion. The Finns, who had fought for weeks with limited resources and home-forged weapons, suddenly found themselves rich in captured equipment. The battlefield became a grim warehouse of opportunity. Soldiers scavenged what they could: boots, coats, food tins, fuel, anything that could help sustain the next phase of the war. Even the Soviet horses, still alive and shivering beside overturned wagons, were gathered and cared for, their strength repurposed for the defense of Finland. Reports of the disaster reached Moscow quickly, carried by the few officers who had escaped. What they described enraged the Soviet High Command. The Red Army had lost not only men and material but also pride. The myth of invincibility had been shattered by a nation 1/10 its size. Stalin, who had expected a swift and glorious campaign, was furious. In his failure was not a result of poor planning or impossible conditions, it was treachery, cowardice, or incompetence. And in Stalin's Russia, such offenses were paid for in blood. Within weeks, purges began. Commanders who had led the 44th Division were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Others were quietly demoted or sent to remote fronts, erased from official records. Reports of the defeat were rewritten to soften the truth, claiming heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. But those who had seen Great Road with their own eyes knew the reality. The soldiers had been sacrificed to arrogance, a leadership that had sent them into an unforgiving wilderness without proper maps, clothing, or understanding of the enemy they faced. In Finland, word of the victory spread through villages and towns like fire in dry grass. People gathered around radios and newspapers, marveling at how their small army had humbled one of the most powerful forces on earth. But their pride was tempered with sorrow. Every Finnish victory came at a cost. Families wept for the sons who had not returned, men who now slept beneath the snow beside their fallen enemies. In homes across the country, candles were lit not for celebration but remembrance. The triumph on the Great Road was both a testament to human resilience and a haunting reminder of what survival demanded. Foreign journalists who managed to visit the aftermath wrote reports filled with disbelief. Photographs showed endless lines of Soviet corpses stretching into the horizon, frozen in grotesque stillness. Military analysts called it one of the most complete routes in modern warfare. The world took notice. For the first time, Finland's struggle became more than a regional conflict. It became a symbol of defiance against tyranny. Volunteers from across Europe, inspired by the stories of the ski troops and their impossible victory, began to arrive, eager to fight for what they saw as a noble cause. Yet the Finns knew better than to celebrate too loudly. They understood that this victory, however magnificent, was only a reprieve. The Soviet Union had resources far beyond their reach: more men, more weapons, more time. Stalin's pride would not allow him to accept defeat. The Red Army would learn from its mistakes, reorganize, and return with greater fury. And when it did, the Finns would once again be forced to fight not just for victory, but for survival itself. In the meantime, the captured supplies from the Great Road became a lifeline. Finnish engineers repaired the tanks, adapted the weapons, and redistributed the ammunition to units across the front. The food and medical supplies saved countless lives in the harsh weeks that followed. Even in destruction, the battlefield had given something back. The frozen dead had unwittingly armed their conquerors, turning their loss into Finland's endurance. As winter deepened, the snow slowly erased the traces of what had happened. Burned trucks sank beneath new drifts. Footprints vanished overnight. Only the scarred trees and scattered helmets remained, silent witnesses to the madness of men. For those who had fought there, the memories never faded: the sound of skis gliding through snow, the crack of gunfire echoing through the forest, the sight of frozen faces staring endlessly into the white. In Moscow, the executed commanders were replaced by others who understood that failure was no longer an option. Orders were rewritten, strategies revised, and reinforcements gathered. The Soviet war machine, wounded but not broken, prepared to strike again. The defeat at Great Road would be avenged. Stalin promised, even if it took every soldier the Union could muster. But among the Finnish ranks, morale soared. They had done the impossible. They had shown the world that courage, intelligence, and the will to survive could triumph over sheer numbers. In the quiet of the northern night, as snow fell over the battlefield once more, the Finns stood guard along the line, their rifles ready, their breath rising into the freezing air. The victory was theirs, but so too was the burden of what it had cost. And as the northern lights shimmered faintly above, they knew the war was not ending, it was only gathering strength. As Finland fought for its survival beneath a curtain of snow and the ashes of burned trucks still marked the Great Road, Europe drifted deeper into darkness. Far to the west, where the frost gave way to crumbling cities and echoing speeches, another kind of war was being waged, one not of bullets and bayonets, but of ideology and control. It was New Year's Day, 1940. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood before the microphones. His voice carried across the airwaves into millions of homes. His words were sharp, deliberate, and heavy with the promise of destruction. He declared that the so-called Jewish capitalist world would not survive the century, framing the global conflict not merely as a battle for power, but as a crusade against imagined enemies. It was both a warning and a prophecy, one that signaled the tightening grip of a regime that had already plunged much of Europe into fear. Hitler's message was more than rhetoric, it was a signal of total mobilization. Germany's war machine was to become unstoppable, driven by the steel of its factories and the will of its people. To ensure this, Hermann Göring, already one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy, was given control over the entire German war industry. His task was absolute: to transform Germany into a nation built for endless war. Coal, steel, Labor everything was to be directed toward the front. Civilian needs faded into the background as the rhythm of production became the heartbeat of the Reich. Under Goering's direction, the vast machinery of industry began to hum day and night, churning out tanks, aircraft, and munitions with mechanical precision. But power came with chaos. Goering's greed and ego turned the process into a contest of influence, where loyalty mattered more than efficiency. Industrial magnates scrambled for favor, generals demanded resources, and workers toiled under increasing pressure. Propaganda films showed smiling laborers forging the tools of victory, but reality was darker. Men and women worked long hours in freezing factories, their wages barely enough to survive. Coal shortages left cities cold, while the elite dined in warmth. Still, dissent was unthinkable. The Gestapo's shadow stretched over every conversation, every whisper. To question the war effort was to vanish without trace. Beyond Germany's borders, the results of Hitler's vision were already visible. In occupied Poland, the human cost of conquest was laid bare. The year turned, but for those trapped in ghettos and camps, time had lost meaning. The once bustling streets of Warsaw were silent under a curfew that began before nightfall. Starvation became an everyday weapon. Bread was rationed to crumbs. Potatoes and soup stretched beyond their limits. Families traded heirlooms for food. Then clothing. Then anything left that might be exchanged for survival. The cattle trucks that rolled through the rail stations no longer carried livestock, they carried people. Prisoners of war sealed inside for days at a time. When the doors opened, the bitter air revealed what hunger and cold had done. Soldiers counted bodies mechanically, while the living were herded away, dazed and half-frozen, to labor or confinement. And yet, even amid such misery, defiance flickered. Underground groups began to form in Poland's shattered cities. Teachers held secret classes in basements. Priests whispered sermons of hope. Smuggled newspapers carried reports of Finnish victories against the Red Army, stories that spread like small fires in the darkness. To many Poles, those frozen battles in the north became symbols of resistance, the idea that courage, even from a small nation, could defy a giant. But the cost was steep. Every act of defiance drew punishment. Villages suspected of sheltering resistance members were razed. Families disappeared overnight, their names erased from records. The occupiers ruled not just with guns, but with the slow grinding weight of fear. Inside Germany, the propaganda ministry celebrated victory after victory, even when none had been won. Newspapers described the heroic advances in Poland and the renewed strength of the Reich, while the truth was carefully hidden beneath slogans. The war had not yet reached the scale it would soon achieve, but the foundations were being laid. Factories built under Goering's authority began producing on a scale Europe had never seen. The skies above the Ruhr were lit not by fireworks or celebration, but by the glow of furnaces burning through the night. Every ton of steel and every new engine pushed the continent closer to catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Finland, soldiers dug deeper into the snow, listening to distant radio broadcasts from Europe's capitals. The voices spoke of alliances, strategies, and power, but none of them mentioned the ordinary people who were paying the price. In China, the bitter stalemate against Japan continued, with villages destroyed and cities reduced to rubble. Across the globe, war had ceased to be confined to armies, it had become a way of life, consuming everything in its path. Back in Germany, Goering reveled in his new authority. His headquarters filled with the scent of cigars and the sound of telephones ringing endlessly. Reports arrived, hourly production quotas met, new contracts signed, supply chains secured. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. Corruption bled into the system. Resources were wasted on vanity projects. Factories built under haste collapsed under strain. But for the moment, none of that mattered. The machine was running, And as long as it moved, Hitler's vision lived. By the end of the first week of 1940, the world was holding its breath. The Finnish snows were red with blood. China was locked in an unending struggle, and Poland was starving under the weight of occupation. Hitler's voice, broadcast across Europe, still echoed like a curse. His words promised the destruction of an entire order, a reshaping of civilization according to his will. Göring's factories were ready to make it real, and somewhere in the heart of Warsaw, a child pressed their face to a frosted window, watching soldiers march past, their boots thudding in rhythm with the machinery of empire. The new year had begun not with hope, but with fire, hunger, and silence. And as the smoke from 1,000 chimneys drifted into the sky from the furnaces of Germany to the ruins of Poland, it seemed as though the whole world was preparing to burn. As the first months of 1940 slipped away, the world seemed to stand on the edge of something vast and irreversible. Snow still covered the Finnish front, where exhausted soldiers clung to their rifles in frozen trenches, their breath clouding the bitter air. In the flickering light of campfires, they whispered the names of fallen comrades and wondered if their homeland would survive the winter. The silence between battles was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery echoing through the pines. Every shell that fell reminded them that their courage, however great, might not be enough to change the tide of history. Thousands of miles away, the war in China dragged on a brutal struggle without end. Entire villages lay in ruins, swallowed by smoke and despair. The dreams of liberation that once united Chinese factions had splintered into distrust and political betrayal. The fragile alliances forged to resist Japan were now unraveling. Soldiers who once fought side by side turned their weapons on each other, while civilians endured hunger, disease, and the weight of promises broken by ambition. What began as a fight for sovereignty was dissolving into chaos, leaving behind nothing but grief. For those who survived, hope became a dangerous luxury, and in occupied Poland, life had become a quiet nightmare. Streets once filled with laughter and commerce now echoed only with the sound of boots on cobblestones and the creak of wagons carrying the dead. Families huddled in basements, whispering prayers they no longer believed would be heard. Winter was cruel, but the occupation was crueler. Every day was a negotiation for survival between hunger, cold, and the constant fear of being taken away. Even so, fragments of defiance glimmered amid the darkness. A loaf of bread shared in secret, a poem passed hand to hand, a whispered song of the homeland. These small acts became symbols of something indestructible, the human will to endure. From Finland's white silence to China's burning villages and Poland's shattered streets, suffering became a language that transcended borders. Yet across the Atlantic, in the United States, that language remained distant. The American people watched the chaos unfold through headlines and newsreels, shaken but detached. Memories of the Great War still haunted them, the graves, the widows, the broken promises of peace. Isolationism was more than policy. It was self-preservation. The Atlantic Ocean felt like a wall, shielding them from Europe's madness. But history, as always, had other plans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke cautiously in his fireside chats, urging vigilance without declaring commitment. Factories hummed quietly, producing the tools of industry rather than war. Life went on: baseball games, movie theaters, jazz clubs, while the rest of the world burned. Yet beneath the rhythm of ordinary life, unease was growing. Americans could feel the tremors from across the ocean. They read of children starving in Warsaw, of Japanese air raids over Chongqing, of the Soviet tanks crawling across Finland's snows. Each story eroded the illusion that distance could guarantee safety. The world, once divided by geography and ideology, was now linked by shared agony. No nation would remain untouched forever. The lines being drawn in 1940 would define not just territories, but the moral boundaries of humanity itself. And in this moment between wars already raging and those yet to come, mankind faced a question it had never truly answered. How much suffering would it take before the world learned? For the soldiers in Finland, the answer was written in blood on the snow. For the peasants in China, it was carved into the ashes of their homes. For the civilians in Poland, it was whispered in hunger and fear. Each of them bore the cost of decisions made far away, by men who measured victory not in lives saved but in lines moved on a map. Their pain was both personal and universal, a mirror reflecting the same truth: power without empathy always breeds tragedy. But even amid this desolation, there were moments of grace. A Finnish nurse tending to frostbitten soldiers who would never fight again. A Chinese mother teaching her children to read by the light of a single candle. A Polish priest risking his life to deliver bread to the condemned. These fragments of humanity glowed like stars against a blackened sky. They reminded the world, and all of us who look back now, that even in the darkest times, compassion endures. History often remembers wars by their battles and their leaders, the treaties signed, the borders redrawn, the flags raised. But the truth of this time lies in smaller things, in the quiet footsteps of refugees, in the trembling hands that wrote final letters home, in the frozen tears of those who buried their loved ones without markers. Those are the stories that tell us what war truly costs. As the episode closes, we are left with a simple but haunting reflection. Across continents and ideologies, the pain was shared. Even if the world refused to unite, the United States stood apart for now, but isolation would prove temporary. Soon, the echoes of Europe's suffering would reach American shores, forcing the nation to choose between distance and duty. Until then, the world turned under a sky heavy with smoke and snow, and the human spirit, though battered, starved, and betrayed, refused to die. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us on this journey through one of history's darkest winters. If you found meaning in these stories, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep uncovering the truths that time almost forgot and reminding the world that behind every headline and every war, there are real people, real pain, and the enduring hope that humanity can learn and change.